welcome to this witness seminar. John Maiden is going to be leading us through and chairing it, so we'll explain exactly what's happening in due course. But as the current director of Resource, I'm delighted to welcome you to this, whether you are familiar with the organisation at the moment or not. I'm just allowing others to enter. Some of you I know were present for last month's seminar on the work of the Fountain Trust, and it really was a remarkable gathering, I think it's fair to say, in terms of some of the memories that were shared and the people who had different perspectives on this. And this is all part of the work that we're doing on the history of charismatic renewal, but also the lessons for the life of the church today. And so I'm really grateful to all of you for being part of this and part of what we hope will ultimately be a real blessing to today's church, as well as an opportunity to reflect and collect memories from yesteryear. I think most of the people who have been trying to get in have managed it. So on that basis, I will now formally hand over to John Maiden from the Open University, who is chair of our advisory group for this Charismatic Renewal History project. And John is going to guide us through this afternoon's witness seminar. So thanks, John, for being with us again.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this and to help to facilitate this witness seminar. I'm based at the Open University, where I'm head of department for religious studies, and one of the things, I suppose the main thing that I'm interested in is the history of charismatic Christianity, and thoroughly enjoyed our first witness seminar on the Fountain Trust. In fact, was positively enthused by it, and all kinds of different follow-up questions have occurred to me, and so personally it's been very helpful, but I hope also it's proving interesting and helpful to you all as well. As Christopher said, if not an opportunity to learn from history, I think hopefully an opportunity to think with history and with a sense of historical context in mind. So the purpose of these witness seminars is really for us to share, well, for you to share your experiences, insights, recollections of different aspects of the charismatic renewal. As Christopher said, in the first seminar we looked at the Fountain Trust conferences, and we went up to 1978. And actually the pre-Lambeth conference, and where of course sharing of ministries abroad was formed, and we're kind of going to be picking up there today as we continue these seminars, looking at the formation of Anglican renewal ministries, and I suppose the relationship of charismatics with the wider Church of England and beyond in the 1980s and the 1990s and after. So I will begin, actually, Christopher, if we can have the first slide, please.
Can I just have your name?
My name, yes, my name is John Maiden.
Thank you.
I am who I say I am. And that's not a theological, there's not a biblical reference there. Right, and the next slide, please, Christopher. Yeah, so here's our program for today. we've done our welcome. I'm going to begin with a few, probably about 10 minutes of thinking briefly about the historical context of the 1980s and the 1990s, in particular, looking at charismatic renewal and Anglicanism after the Fountain Trust. We then have, I suppose, our star witness, if I may call you that, John, Bishop John Finney, is going to begin by offering us some of his own reflections on the formation of ARM, and then we'll open it up to everyone to share as they wish to. And a reminder that this session is being recorded. If you don't wish to be recorded, and if you don't wish, and potentially, this resource will be used by future researchers and quoted and used in different publications and all of that kind of thing. So if you wish to, if you don't wish to be recorded or wish to be anonymous, you probably need to kind of hang up now, unfortunately, and perhaps email with your recollections instead. And yes, and we're going to aim to finish at about 3:30. Okay, so I'm going to begin now with a few comments on the background context. John, could you take us to the next? Sorry, Christopher, could you take us to the next slide, please? As I did last time, I'm afraid I'm going to do a shameless plug for my book. I did spend 8 years writing it, so I feel like I do have a kind of a right to try and persuade you to read it. If you are interested in the history of the charismatic renewal, or you were part of the charismatic renewal, this may be something that will interest you. Age of the Spirit, Charismatic Renewal, the Anglo World and Global Christianity, 1945 to 1980. It does actually go right up to the present day in the final chapter. We look at the legacies of the charismatic renewal. And that's published by Oxford University Press. And I wrote it, yes, it's a scholarly work, but I really wrote it in the hope that charismatic leaders, church leaders would read it and would benefit from it. So I hope it is written accessibly and interestingly. And what I'm going to say now is really kind of taken from that research. So first, the end of the Fountain Trust. So actually, if you look at the minutes of the leadership of the Fountain Trust, since about 1977, there was a sense that the renewal was stuck, and they used that word, stuck. And at the end of 1977, Tom Smale described a prophecy in an editorial of Renewal, the Fountain Trust magazine, which compared charismatics to the children of Israel in Exodus, looking back to times of supernatural blessing and forward to a promised land of renewal and revival. But where were they then? They were in the wilderness and needed to take a new step forward. Smale was to resign in 1979, and in 1980, a new director, Michael Barling, took over. And no sooner had he took over, he announced this sense that God is doing a new thing. Possibly, he suggested in the direction of evangelism, or of reconciliation, or of social action. While the renewal of the church was far from over, Barling asserted that the Fountain Trust needed to die, as, quote, in the working of God, new life comes out of death. Now, in the 1980s, there was a trend towards, and in many ways, the different denominations were following the Roman Catholics in this, towards charismatics seeking denominational integration and legitimacy. The view of the Fountain Trust, and I quote, was things with the charismatic label are no longer outrageous and sensational, which is quite remarkable. If you remember 20 years earlier, to to describe oneself as charismatic was, well, could be met with a range of responses, and not all of them positive. Amongst Anglicans, confidence had been taken from Archbishop Donald Coggan's message in the 1978 pre-Lambeth Conference, charismatic gathering, and the suggestion that Christians should pray for the, quote, death of the charismatic movement because it had become so part of the mainstream was often to be heard. So there was a sense amongst the charismatics that actually perhaps it was time for the charismatic movement to die in order that it could become part of the and play a fuller part of the mainstream. And it's in this context of rising denominationalism and denominationalization that the Fountain Trust ends and Anglican Renewal Ministries rises up. There were cross currents at this time, and I'm not going to say too much about these cross currents because I think you'll be well aware of them and what they involved. John Wimber, Wimberism, as I call it in Age of the Spirit, had an enormous impact in the 1980s. The idea of power ministry, the real emphasis on church planting and the expectation that churches that were spirit-filled would grow, and that notion of everybody gets to play, of every member ministry. Wimber emphasizes each of those, and they're widely practiced in the Church of England amongst charismatics in the 1980s. David Pitches, in his book Come Holy Spirit, 1985, argued that confirmation of the gospel through signs and wonders was, quote, more relevant than ever in the 1980s, and it became a bestseller. In fact, Wimber's influence on Anglican charismatics was so great that people like Pitches were traveling to the United States to tell Episcopalian charismatics there that they should be listening to John Wimber. So Wimber has a marked influence during this phase, also on the HTB network and on New Wine, as New Wine is taking shape. So the Wimber formula of worship, teaching, the ministry time, where individuals in the congregation respond to words of knowledge, prophecy, coming forward to prayer, becomes a kind of normal pattern of ministry in many charismatic contexts. Then we have the Kansas City Prophets. The Kansas City Fellowship had been established in 1982 by Mike Bickle. He pastored a group of men, including Bob Jones, John Paul Jackson, Paul Cain, who collectively become known as the Kansas City Prophets. They share a conviction that a resurgence of prophecy was a sign of a last days victorious church. And indeed, for many people who witnessed these men in action, they did seem to have a remarkable gifting. They talked also what Paul Cain called the new breed of Christians. John Wimber was initially drawn towards the Kansas City Fellowship, and Cain, Bickle, and others begin to work closely with Wimber. And I suppose with his kind of imprimatur, the Kansas City Prophets almost receive a kind of endorsement by charismatic leaders in Britain, including people like Graham Cray, David Pitches, Terry Virgo. So we have the Kansas City Prophets having some influence on the Anglican charismatic scene in the 1980s and 1990s. Then, in January 1984, a revivalistic phenomenon appeared to have broken out at Toronto Airport Vineyard Church. The Toronto blessing became synonymous with the experience of soaking in God's love, of healings, slayings in the spirit, manifestations such as laughter, spiritual drunkenness, and even animal noises. There were, in fact, antecedents for a number of those things within the charismatic renewal in Britain. So I can find references to what was described quaintly as holy mirth in Renewal magazine in the 1960s at charismatic prayer groups. So this is not something that's entirely new, but it does have a marked influence on many Anglican charismatic Christians in the early 1990s. So these are some of the cross currents for around at the time of Anglican renewal ministries. Now, I'm actually not going to say a great deal about Anglican renewal ministries this afternoon, because John Finney is going to talk to us in a moment, and I think there's a great deal of kind of institutional memory, if you like, on this Zoom call, so I don't think I need to say much. But different dimensions to its work. There were what was sometimes called the great celebrations of Anglican renewal ministries, the big kind of set piece moments within the organisation. Its involvement with new wine too, at the kind of larger scale. But as Lawrence Hoyle, one of the early leaders of the organisation, said, to be real, the renewal needed to be local. It needed to be involved in the nitty-gritty of church life. So you have travelling teams visiting different churches for renewal weekends, Anglican renewal ministries having a very kind of local impact as well as a larger national impact. But beyond the local and the national, there was also the global. Looking at the Anglican renewal ministries magazine, as I've been doing over the last few days, there are often references to what is happening in the global church. What can Anglicans learn from dioceses overseas? It's interesting that, for example, before the ICOE conference in Brighton in, I think, 1991, Anglican Renewal Ministries and SOMA co-host a conference. So there's also that global dimension. So if next slide, please, Christopher. So I hope I've somewhat helpfully introduced, hopefully helped to set up a conversation for today. And I don't at all want to be prescriptive on what we should talk about and what we should not be talking about. But here are some of the things that I think might be of interest to us. It would be great to have people's memories of the conferences. What were your experiences of the conferences? What were they like? How did they change? What was the mood of the conferences? What was the subculture, if you like, around the conferences? Then there's the question of relations with the wider Church of England. How was or how wasn't charismatic renewal engaging with the wider church? Was it becoming more acceptable during that time? How? Ecumenical relations. The ecumenical dimension of charismatic renewal had been remarkably strong, but perhaps its defining feature in the 1960s and the 1970s. Where did that go? What about these cross currents that I've mentioned? Wimber, Kansas City Prophets, Toronto. Wider renewal networks. How did Anglican renewal ministries fit into that wider ecosystem of charismatic renewal within the Church of England? New Wine, HTB, Alpha, and then those connections with the global South. What were they? How influential were they? I think I've said enough. In a moment, I will do my best to kind of share the discussion. But before we do that, I now want to hand over to John Finney, who is going to give some of his own recollections and reflections on ARM. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you very much, John. In a way, I'm going back now to the beginnings of ARM, and the period you described at the end of the 70s when people were thinking, now what's going to happen next? Some organizations have been around for some time, some were just burgeoning. And renewal was becoming a bit more public, and questions were being asked. Parishes which just had prayer meetings were now finding that renewal was affecting the whole church, and not always very easily. Some churches were growing vastly, others were finding a lot of difficulties. In 78, the General Synod set in motion a commission, a report. And I can remember waiting with bated breath to see what the report would be like when it was eventually published in 81. So there was a great sense of now what? And it's here that Lawrence Hoyle comes into the picture. He ran a conference centre in his vicarage at Thwing in the depths of Yorkshire wolds. And in 79, he went over to America and came across Chuck Irish of the Episcopal Renewal Ministries. And it confirmed to him the importance of a denominational agency servicing renewal in the Church of England. And it was this time of now what? And there were meetings in London, as it were, to think and to pray, to find out God's will. And he and John Gunston, who was the ecumenical officer in Manchester, went down to this meeting. There were an awful lot of people talking at cross purposes, they felt, and came away rather disappointed. The only decision was to meet again in 6 months' time. Good meeting. And so they went along in 6 months' time to hear what was going to happen. They felt that the meeting got nowhere. And on the way to Marble Arch Underground, in order to get the train, they decided that just the two of them, that they were going to hold a meeting up north. And John writes that they decided they would go to Scargill in the Yorkshire Dales because it was far enough north not to be noticed by the leaders of the renewal in the south. And I was invited to go along to this. It was a very, very impressive meeting under the leadership of Richard Hare, Bishop of Pontefract. And it was at this that in July 80, that ARM was launched. And I found myself on the advisory group, and we started planning for a much bigger conference at Swanwick the following year. I think this is an important element which we need to look at carefully when we're thinking about the whole history of the Charismatics, because there's many strands in it. There's the well-recorded one, I think, with names like John Collins and David Watson and David McInnes, HGB and Chorley Wood and so on. But I think they had remarkably little effect in the Midlands and the North, and maybe in the West as well. I can remember as a vicar in the 70s, and in a sense seen as a leader in Nottingham, we just got on with doing where we felt the Holy Spirit led us. We occasionally heard and read books, of course, of what's happening elsewhere, but basically we weren't so affected by the great things were happening in the south. And there's no doubt the ARM conferences, which were tended to be in the north, and particularly, of course, in Swanwick, and the publications like Saints Alive and Saints for Healing were invaluable in the local parish for fellowship and for learning. And if I had 5 questions, which I think we might need to examine further, I think the different churchmanships are interesting. John Gunston, you see, was a high churchman.
Yeah.
And alongside everything, there's the Anglo-Catholic Charismatic Fellowship, which is centered at Walsingham. There's a considerable emphasis on the local Anglican church. This is very much one of Lawrence's main themes. I think, to be honest, there was less concern for theological niceties. We didn't feel that we had John Stott checking out everything that we were doing and saying. Socially, I think, to be honest, we were a little bit more ordinary. Lawrence was a lad from Barnsley, and who had made good. And it had that slightly northern, amateurish, let's get on with it sort of flavour about it. And undoubtedly, I think, the sense of togetherness, of being together with Methodists, Congregationists, all of whom, of course, at this time were forming their own fellowships, as well as with the Roman Catholics, I think was a very rich and important part of that period. And I can remember working with the leader of the AOG and also with the local Roman Catholic priest to forward a big conference that we held for Nottingham. So it was a most fascinating, interesting time. The now what was beginning to become answered, I think, but maybe not in the way that maybe some of those people were expecting. And I'd be very interested to know the memories of so many of you who also were part of that late 70s, early 80s. John.
Thank you very much, John. And perhaps, so I think it'd be helpful just to mention again the points that you raised at the end around the different churchmanships. Yeah. Around location and northernness as a Manc, a lad from Manchester. I'm always pleased to hear about the what's happening up north. And the other main points you raised there as well, John.
Yes, I said I think less concern for theological niceties.
Yes.
We weren't too fussed, we just got on with it.
Yeah.
And if people were ministered to in the name of Christ, hallelujah.
Yeah.
What exactly it was didn't fuss us too much.
Yeah.
We tended to call it baptism in the Spirit, but we weren't too worried if other people wanted to call it something else. I think there was this ground, ecumenism on the ground, I think, which was very marked in many of the areas of the north that I was in contact with. It was, in fact, probably far more effective than some of the more official ecumenism of shared services and all the rest of it. And then I think, yes, the different churchmanships, obviously, which you mentioned.
Thanks, John. I think that's incredibly helpful in terms of setting up this discussion. And I do think, from a kind of historian's perspective, I think you're absolutely right, actually, that where there are narratives about the development of renewal in the Church of England, they tend to be narratives that are dominated by interest in HTB and in new wine, and perhaps AWM is something of a missing strand in our understanding of the overall movement, and its northernness is I think something we should ponder on. I will stop talking. So if we're as given the northern roots of what we're talking about, we don't need to be too polite. We don't need too many niceties here. If you want to use the hand raise function, please do so. Or just raise your hand, or just speak up, and we'll try and make sure everyone gets to everyone gets to play, to go back to Wimber. And Christopher, would you mind just putting the final slide that I had on as well? Just that might just kind of help us to give us a few guideposts through the conversation, but also keeping in mind the points that John has raised there. Okay, who would like to go first? Should we just begin with some kind of general reflections on the conferences that people attended?
I think I was present at the inaugural conference up at Scargill.
Sorry, Roger, I'm just going to stop you there because I forgot to say something. If you and if everyone else, just at the beginning, if you could introduce yourself and just give us a very short bio, a sentence, that would be helpful in terms of the recording. Thank you, Roger.
I'm Roger Vaughan, in the Diocese of Lichfield, up in the middle, but looking north. And I was on the inaugural conference at Scargill, partly because I'd been very ill, read a book by a chap I'd helped get through his Greek exams at college, a bloke called Colin Urquhart, who wrote a book called When the Spirit Comes. That got me interested. I realised there was something missing in my life, though I could reflect on many of the things that Colin was saying. I sort of drifted into prayer in tongues and charismatic renewal, went and told the bishop, who said, go away and enjoy it. And I have done ever since. I was put on, I don't know how, to John Gunston, because I was in the sort of Anglo-Catholic end of the church. And all the other people I'd met were, you know, Bible study, evangelical types. And John took me under his wing. And I think that's why I went up to for the initial conference at Scargill, which changed my life, really.
Thank you, Roger. Chris Edmondson. Chris, I think you raised your hand earlier, but
I'm just seeing the questions or the bullet points on the screen at the moment. Is that right?
Yes, but I mean, say whatever you would like to say, but if you would like to talk about the conferences in particular, that's fine.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, Chris Edmondson. For most of my ministry, certainly in the 80s, serving in the north of England, and most of my rest of the ministry as well, except for a few years at Lee Abbey. Two things really in relation to what both Johns have said today. One is on the cross currents. I was working in Halifax in the 1980s as a vicar in an urban priority area. And one of the biggest challenges to many of us who were beginning to put toes in the water in charismatic renewal was actually the development of the house churches, and in particular the Bradford Abundant Life Church as it became. And one of the great gifts of ARM, and I had the privilege of leading worship at some of the early conferences as well as attending, was the fact that it was actually okay to be Anglican still, because there was a great pressure on many of us in Yorkshire at that time, particularly, and the Dales Bible Week, that again may come into some people's memories, that actually if you're going to be where the Spirit is leading, you need to leave the Anglican Church. And I would say for me, that was another of those cross currents actually. And the gift of ARM was the fact that actually it was okay to still be part of the Anglican Church and open to what the Spirit was doing. And I remember a conference at which both John Gunston and George Carey were speaking, and again, as has been alluded to, different churchmanships represented there. And the way in which, again, that was such an affirming experience, really. The way in which the Spirit was drawing people together from different traditions, but, you know, authentically at work within the Church of England. So I was deeply grateful for the gift of ARM at a time when it felt quite insecure with one of those other sorts of cross current that was going on.
Thank you very much. And Chris, may I ask you just a kind of follow-up question there? Were there, I mean, yeah, Bradford and that area was, I suppose, a real kind of centre for some of the independent charismatic churches. Did you know Anglicans who left the Church of England to attend these churches?
Yes, the church of which I became a vicar in 1979 had lost about 15 or 20 of its key lay leaders, including a church warden and a reader. And my predecessor had sadly left the Church of England for a period of time. He returned, deeply wounded by some of those effects. So I came into a kind of wounded history situation at that time. And there were a couple of other Anglican clergy around the area who also felt they should leave the Church of England at that time. But John Finney has already referred to Bishop Richard Hare. And for those of us in that part of the world, and particularly the then Diocese of Wakefield, again, Richard was such a hugely supportive person, you know, in those respects, and in the helping of sensing that we should stay where God had called us to be and see what God would do.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's really fascinating. Would anyone else like to talk about the conferences or anything else? John, is it John's iPad?
John Hughes. Yes, I was started at St Mark's, Gillingham, and experienced the coming of the Spirit as an all-night prayer meeting, and went into the ministry. And I was in banking, went into the ministry, and had a curacy at St Andrew's, Chorleywood with John Perry, and then at St Stephen's, Twickenham with Martin Pepiot, and then went to lead a church at High Wycombe. I remember going to some conferences, and what a breath of fresh air Richard Hare was. And then going to HTB for, I think the Kansas Prophets came, John Paul Jackson and one or two of them. And they prophesied over people, and they spoke over me from Isaiah 49, where God speaks about making your mouth a sharpened sword and being hid in his quiver. And they said, God is doing something in your church, and there will come a time where you will be taking that out with teams to the wider church. And one of the things, I had very close links with New Wine, and led the Bible readings there on 3 occasions. And, you know, that was a real blessing at New Wine. And then they opened up possibilities of taking teams out, both in the south and in the north. And it started really with getting a phone call from a speaker who was going to, I think it was Harry Cook, and he was going to speak at St John's Ferndown, and he was taken sick, and I was asked to go in his place, not having really any time to prepare, and just experiencing the goodness of God in what God did in that weekend. So I found that was being launched into the deep end was part of the process, and really experienced some wonderful things happening.
Thank you, John. And if I hope you don't mind me asking, are you the John Hughes who was at St James and Emmanuel in Didsbury?
No, that's my twin brother, David Hughes.
Ah, right. Okay, right.
We're identical twins.
Ah, right. Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, we've touched actually on this question of. Oh, sorry. I'm just trying to keep up with messages. We'll go Jenny Bruin, Don Bruin, sorry, and then we'll come back to Richard in the hope that he's back with us. Jenny.
I am a really small local fish, but as I look across all these screens, I just honour so many people whom I've heard speak over the time. I came across ARM, I think it would have been March 1981, and I think John Marsh and Roger Vaughan and Harry Cook and Lawrence Hoyle were in Ipswich, and I lived just south of Norwich, and I went there, and I've been a follower of ARM and resource following on from that. I was at Swanwick. I was at Swanwick earlier this week at a Derby clergy conference, and I'm looking at my notes on a conference that I went to in October 1988, when David Pitches, Mary Pitches, and J. John were speaking, and I just honour that, you know, having that connection to ARM over all the years, and then coming into resource. And I don't know. I was trained as an ordained local minister in Norwich, and worked in Norfolk, and now I'm in Derby. When I moved to Derby, because my daughter lives here, I knew I was coming to another home of ARM, and the things that went on, and the magazine and things. So I feel myself really blessed to be, you know, to hear this, to see people across this screen who I've come across as the leaders of ARM and speakers. And I continue to be part of the local church, and I love to be real, it must be local. So can I say thank you to everybody across the screen?
You can indeed. I mean, it's a bit of a who's who of ARM today.
I know,
so
yes.
a good time to say thank you, I'm sure. Don.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to see some of these faces that I recognize. I'm still of age 35 and I'm sticking to it. I don't change my mind from one year to the next. But I just wanted to mention Michael Harper, whose
Yes.
name hasn't been mentioned so far, who had a great influence on all sorts of people at around that time. And he was my predecessor in as a national director of SOMA, and he was hugely helpful to me as I was starting, having been a proper vicar for a while, to travel to these places, and enjoyed the company of some of the people here. So let's remember Michael Harper and thank God for him too.
Yes.
Thank you, Don. I'm going to try Richard again, and then Sue.
Sorry, my technology malfunctioned. Can you hear me now?
We can, and we can see you.
Yeah, great. I came to faith in 1972, and on home from university, I was invited to someone's lounge in Northwood, Middlesex, where I later realised that the speaker had been Colin Urquhart, who prayed for me to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And I spoke in tongues for the first time while witnessing to a tramp on my return to Oxford. Had a little bit to do with renewal meetings over the next 10 years, though my first curiosity was in a very conservative evangelical parish. But then I did go to that conference at St Mary's Ferndown, which John has referred to, where he and his brother took part. And I was going through an extremely difficult period where I just felt on my own in the two churches that I was kind of curate in charge of. And we were asked to be prayed for. And I knew that no one would pray for me from my parishes because there was no one there from my two churches. And for a long time, people were being prayed for and no one was praying for me. When suddenly someone came up from behind and prayed really energetically and in tongues over me. And when I turned around and saw it was Ralph Goldenberg, who one of you probably know, who was actually at that time church warden of the main church at St Mary's Ferndown. I just burst into tears to his love for me to do that. And I didn't realize then that you're not meant to stop tears. Ashamed weeping in front of some of the people that I knew. But anyway, I've learnt from that. But Ralph told me later that was the first time he ever spoke in tongues. And that was quite a significant moment. But then I was at an Anglican Renewal Conference, 1988, I think it was, at Swanwick, where we went into groups and were prayed for. And I went with a leading member of my church. I'd gone to Hull by this time and was there actually 22 years. And someone came from the other end of the room to say that when I was being prayed for, they saw flames over my head, which was a great encouragement. In fact, whilst my time in Dorset had been very difficult, my time in Hull, whilst having the usual trials and tribulations, was actually a time of immense blessings. And we did Saints Alive. Virtually all the church went through Saints Alive. Alpha came along, and there was great growth. But I just want to mention also that when I went to Hull, generally morale was pretty low. It was the area of lowest church attendance in the country at the time. But we had Anglicans for Renewal, and that did inspire and give a positive kind of input into a number of churches there, including my own, very much so. And many of our people took part and grew through participation in those meetings. But we had Derek Prince a couple of times, and I had one particularly significant experience ministering at one of those meetings. But also I'd like to pay tribute to Robert Warren at St. Thomas's Crooks, actually, who held meetings for ministers and did an enormous amount. And when it came for us to build a completely new church on faith principles, which I know John Hughes has experience of, Robert was a great help to us in that. So please add him into the equation.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to go to Sue and then to Michael. So Sue.
I see lots of friends in front of me. Sue Hope, now living in the. I'm a northerner and I'm living in the north of England, near Durham. Yes, I came to into Renewal in the 70s and visited Arm at Thwing in the days when Lawrence Hall had small gatherings there of local people coming to discover the gifts of the Spirit. But one of the things, it may have been mentioned at the last meeting, which I wasn't able to be at, one of the currents or the strands that was running very powerfully through the 70s and the early 80s was that of community spawned by the Church of the Holy Redeemer, the Fisherfolk communities, which brought their worship into the Anglican Church in a very significant way. And my own experience of that was that we had in St. Michael Belfry in York, there were 60 of us living in 10 separate households, sharing a common purse, trying to follow the gifts and the power of the Spirit in that. And I think that was a very, very significant thing. I suspect the selfish 80s knocked it out, but it was an attempt to follow the Spirit in a particular way and a sort of earthed way that affected the whole of your life. So that's just something important, I think, to record as part of the memories.
Yes.
Thank you, Sue. And that's a fascinating insight, actually. The 80s, did the 80s knock out the communitarianism of charismatic renewal? I will go away and think about that. I think that's a really fascinating question. Michael Mitten. Now, Michael, I think you took over from Lawrence Hoyle. Am I correct? At ARM.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks.
So
John, yeah.
please speak to us.
Okay, just briefly. Yes, I took over from Lawrence in 1989 and was ARM director until 97. So just a few quick reflections on the 90s, which I think are important. The 1991 ARMS SOMA International Conference, I think, was really significant. And I think it brought together a really close companionship with different ARMS, ERMS, ARCs, ERCs, and all the rest of them across the Anglican worldwide communion. And it was definitely influential between all of us, I think. The appointment of George Carey as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1992 was hugely significant. He'd been a good friend of ARM and continued to be so as well. And that really helped, I think, the credibility of ARM and charismatic renewal. I think just in passing, the ordination of women, of course, was a great delight to many of us at ARM in the mid-90s, but for the Anglo-Catholic charismatic renewal movement, this was really difficult. Peter Peterkin, who'd given excellent leadership to this, I know was tremendously exercised by it. And we saw, I think, a really sad, in a way, collapse of the Anglo-Catholic charismatic renewal. I had a very good friendship with them, and that was, I think, quite a loss for the whole renewal movement, actually, during that time. Yeah, I think the other quick things to say is that I think during the 90s, we became aware at ARM of a real need to have a really good quality, as best we could, theological reflection on renewal, which is why we launched Skepsis in the ARM magazine. And people like Adrian Chatfield and Mark Stibbe were a great help with that. Also, we had the tremendous services of Peter and Do Craig Wilde, who are now in glory with Christ, but who were a really helpful influence on imagining new ways of worshipping using excellent liturgy. And again, this was slightly different from some of the forms of charismatic expression which were in the new churches, or indeed in things like New Wine and HTB. And I think we were delighted to see some really imaginative worship during the days of the 90s.
Thank you very much, Michael. I've been reading some of your words from the 90s over the last few days in the old magazine. So good, very good to see you and hear you speak as well. Okay, let's go to Valerie next.
Hello, Valerie Lowe. I'm wanting to follow on from what Michael was saying, because at the time of the 1991 Anglican consultation, I was on the SOMA side as administrator, so working along with ARM very happily in the organisation of that, which I think was a tremendous event. But what went before it, I think, was possibly less recorded, but equally important, in that we were bringing 100 Anglican leaders from the third world countries to take part in that event, which obviously meant, how were we going to fund them? We reckoned it would cost roughly £1,000 on average per person to bring them to England for the consultation and then to stay on for the bigger ecumenical ICO conference, Brighton. The idea, and it came to me from the Lord, I'm quite sure, was to share them with the parishes. I'm sure we had a snappy title for this project, and I can't remember what it was so snappy, but we got 100 parishes to sponsor 100 third world leaders as a sharing of renewal. That may even have been the title. That the leaders gave a month of their time to their sponsoring parish to do whatever that parish wanted. So the parishes benefited, the leaders benefited, and the funding just happened. And there was one just particular aspect of it. There was a weekend gap between the Anglican consultation and the big ecumenical conference. What did one do with all these people who had no accommodation? I didn't make any plans in advance. On the last day of the consultation, I invited all who needed accommodation to come to the main hall and all who could offer accommodation to come. And it just worked.
Wonderful.
It paired off. And if it hadn't done, I would have felt it was a failure. But as it was, that's how it should be.
Thank you very much, Valerie. And I've not heard of that example actually. It's a great example of that kind of mutual interconnection between Global South and Global North Anglicans. So these leaders were staying in English parishes for a month and giving a month to those parishes. That's a wonderful. wonderful example.
Yeah. And it included some bishops, and even the Archbishop of Kenya was involved in it.
Right, right. And thank you very much. And while I remember, actually, one thing I do want to say is that if you're interested in the history of Soma, you should really check out Don Bruin's book on Soma, It Will Emerge. I think Don is here, isn't he? Which I think is still available. Well, certainly it was available still via Amazon, I think. But that's a really good account of certainly his years in Soma. So do check that out. So we deliberately started with a kind of broad question on your experiences of the conferences, and I think that's given us all kinds of different insights onto a range of questions. So we have half an hour to go, and I think we will just, if it's okay with everyone, I think it probably makes sense just to go through briefly these other few kind of themes, if you like. The first of which we've touched on already was relations with the wider Church of England. Now we mentioned George Carey, who I think was at St. John's, Nottingham, around the time that a number of other kind of charismatic leaders were training there or teaching there. But other examples as well. What are people's sense of relations with the wider Church of England during this time? Would anyone like to?
John, can I pass in just for a moment? I didn't know how long the speech was going to go on for. I had a very important engagement, just picking up 3 grandchildren from school.
Okay.
So I'm fair on leave for now. Okay?
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Would anyone like to offer any thoughts on relations with the wider Church of England at this time?
Going back to literally old Roger Vaughan, in the early days, it was very much a few of the clergy of all sorts of churchmanships who'd had these experiences of being filled with the power of the Spirit. We sort of clubbed together a bit and just sort of drifted around various parishes that were interested. And in those first 10 years or so, it was small groups from individual parishes going out around the diocese for mission. But turning the clock on 20 or 30 years, I was asked to go out to Kuching by our bishop, because that was our companion diocese in those days. And the problem there was that because churches tended to be around individual houses and groups and villages, certain sort of charismatic fanatics had come in from, mainly I think from the United States, were causing huge divisions within the Kuching diocese. And I was sent to try and heal those divisions and to point out that this wasn't something which, I've got it, you want it, and if you haven't got it, then you're not a proper Christian. But much more, this is something which can enable us all to be better Christians. So I had 3 months out there at the invitation of the Diocese of Kuching. And so you see how it's spread in my own personal ministry from a very small beginnings in little tiny parish groups to something which, again, touched a much broader issue and a worldwide issue.
Thank you, Roger. I'm going to go to Felicity now, who raised her hand, and then back to Michael. Felicity.
Thank you. You were asking about the wider influence. Just before that, I think one of the other things that ARM did very, very well was encourage diocesan renewal groups. That was long before New Wine Networks or anything. And it again gave a place for ordinary clergy, if I may use that, to get together to support and encourage one another and learn from one another and share good practice. I think we mustn't underestimate the significance of those over that period. I think in terms of the more national influence, as well as things like the report on the charismatic movement that came out in 1981 or so. There were books like Josephine Back's The Good Wine, that was looking at renewal more widely within the church. And the other thing I've noticed is that gradually those of us who had been involved in renewal found ourselves working at diocesan level or national level. And I remember when I started working within training networks, there were very few people who would call themselves charismatic. But gradually, more and more people found themselves there, and it became more and more acceptable, and it was more and more possible to own the title, if you like, or certainly own the experience of the work of the Spirit, and to work that into one's diocesan and more public ministry.
Thank you, Felicity. And before I go to Michael and then Amanda, a quick follow-up question for you. You talked about owning the title. Did charismatic continue as the kind of more and more integrated, I suppose, with the wider church, continue to use the name, the word charismatic, or was it kind of gently dropped, or
I suspect it was often gently dropped, but what one realised when one went to national gatherings were there a lot of people with whom one had things in common. And you would be gently influencing, whether it was the mission network or the training network or the DDO's network. And particularly in things like vocations, the church had to recognise that it was the charismatic churches that were throwing up the vocations. And then one of the things we had to deal with at a diocesan level was where to place all these people who had come through very lively charismatic and mostly evangelical churches. Where could they go for their curacies, where the life wouldn't be absolutely stamped out of them by an incumbent who wasn't sympathetic?
Thank you. Thank you, Felicity. I'm going to go to
maybe
Mike.
not the most positive comment, but those are the people that we now see in incumbencies around the whole country, and as bishops and archdeacons, of course, as well.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Michael, and then we'll go to Amanda.
Thank you. Just to say, I mean, I agree with Felicity is saying very much there about the diocesan renewal groups. They were really important, and I used to visit a lot of them and feel very encouraged by the local work they were doing. As regards the term charismatic, we did actually discuss that, I remember, because there was a move to kind of drop it because the edges of it were giving the name a bad name, but we were very keen to maintain the use of it and to commend an attractive understanding of the word. The other thing is that we decided when Arm Link, which was the magazine I inherited, which was originally called Anglicans for Renewal, we went back to Anglicans for Renewal and decided to send a free copy to all diocesan bishops. And part of the mission, I think, of ARM in the 90s was to really commend the renewal as a real friend to the church, not an irritant, although in a way, perhaps irritant was good as well. And whenever we did an event in any diocese, went traveling for a day of renewal, for example, I would always write to the diocesan bishop and ask for a meeting, and nearly always they would accept that. And I had loads of really interesting meetings with diocesan bishops, and definitely saw during the 90s a change from anxiety and suspicion to not perhaps necessarily open arm welcome, but definitely respect.
Thank you, Michael. Amanda.
Yeah, I just want to endorse what Felicity said. I'm one of the people who grew up in one of those evangelical charismatic churches, very much influenced by Anglican Renewal Ministries. Derek and I were both part of a worship team which led the worship at the Swanwick conferences for a number of years, and that was profoundly shaping of our ministries. I was called to ordained ministry. Felicity was the DDO who first spoke to me and encouraged me to consider something more than self-supporting ministry, and here I am today on the senior staff team in a diocese now, never having thought that that would be the case, but definitely there was that sense of the renewed churches were growing more vocations than could be put into renewed churches. And so they were moving into churches which had perhaps prided themselves that they'd managed to avoid renewal for so many years, and found that they were gently shaping them from inside. And I think that has seen the next generation embedding itself in what the culture of mainstream Anglicanism has become.
Thank you, Amanda. That's I think a really helpful insight. I'm going to move on to the next next theme. Oh no, let's go to John just before we do. Yeah. John Hughes.
Just to say, I think the enormous influence of Michael Harper in the renewal, experiencing it at All Souls Langham Place, and what he gave birth to. But I remember he asked me to go over to the Diocese of Morogoro in Tanzania, because they had some trouble in terms of demonization. And I went over in fear and trembling, and there was a lady who was the Archdeacon's wife who had died. And as she was being taken for burial, there was a banging on the coffin, and they lowered the coffin and brought her out, and she was very much alive. So it was a terrific shock to them, but she was a real firebrand, and but at times she gave the bishops, kept them on their toes, but at times she would go into demonic freezes, really. And I met with this lady and talked with her. And I said, where does this thing start? And she pointed to her head here. And I said, do you have any experience of in childhood over that? And she said, well, my mother died and my aunt looked after me, but she was a very cruel lady, and she would often drag me around by my hair. And I felt actually it wasn't necessarily demonization, it was a wounded spirit, a wounded heart. And I prayed with her and you know, took her through prayer and forgiving her aunt, and she was completely set free and remains so. And it just struck me that actually the global north, or the African nations where they're very strong on spiritual warfare, that was part of something, but it needed also the inner healing ministry. And I was very struck that, you know, we learned from them and they learned from us.
Thank you very much, John. Yes, I mean, you mentioned Michael Harper and Don Bruin did as well. I think just a giant of a figure in charismatic renewal from his time at All Souls onwards. And it's so interesting to me the way that, you know, while he was at All Souls and just before he left All Souls, he and John Stott disagreed. I mean, I've been through the correspondence between them at Lambeth Palace. There was a major disagreement over baptism in the Spirit. But in many ways, Harper, I think, carried the influence of Stott in other ways, yes, in the stay-inism. You know, yes, just as Stott was adamant that Anglicans should stay in evangelicals should stay in the Church of England, So Harper was completely committed to charismatics remaining within the Church of England, although of course eventually he himself leaves. but a real kind of titan of a figure, really. If you want to know more about Harper, he's one of the main actors in my book Age of the Spirit. But there's a second plug for the book. I've been through all his papers at Lambeth Palace. Right. We're going to go now to the question of ecumenism and I think in particular Roman Catholics. What happens with we've talked about kind of ecumenical relations on the ground. Would anyone else like to speak to the kind of ecumenical contacts?
I think the influence of Francis MacNutt, the Dominican, who spoke at many conferences, was absolutely huge.
Yes. And so MacNutt spoke at ARM conferences, did he?
Well, yes, and Westminster Hall.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, thank you, yeah. I'm going to go to Don, and then I'm going to go to Chris, and then I'm going to go to Michael. Don.
When I was a proper vicar, we had sort of ecumenical celebrations at the Civic Hall, and the first time we deliberately interviewed different people, and somebody called John was interviewed, and they said, well, where did you come to know the Lord? And he gave a conversion testimony, and all the Baptists clapped and so on. And then how did the Holy Spirit become real to you? And all the Pentecostals clapped and so on and so on. And then said, well, and what are you doing now? I'm a Roman Catholic priest. And all the jaws hit the ground. Because in those days, this was quite a long time ago, it was completely impossible for people to recognize that it was possible to be a Roman Catholic and baptized in the Spirit. And it was a great joy to see the way in which that challenged people's, if you like, Protestantism.
Thank you, Don. You say next, Michael, I think. Yes.
Thank you. Just briefly, Michael Harper was brilliant at relationships with leaders of other denominations. I witnessed that many times, deeply respectful of them, and formed good relationships with them. But the person I would really want to pay tribute to on this would be Charles Whitehead, who's done remarkable work commending charismatic renewal in the Roman Catholic Church, but also such a warm person towards those of us of different denominations. His wife Sue is Anglican, so they have an ecumenical marriage, but Charles has done a huge amount to reach out his hands to so many of us, and he must be really recorded as someone who's made a huge contribution in good relationships through charismatic renewal and ecumenically.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think Charles Whitehead a really influential figure. I'm sure you're right. I'm sorry if you can hear the noise. It's just students walking past. And I'm going to go now to Chris.
Thank you. Sorry, just unmuting myself. Flying the Yorkshire flag again, I think particularly in the 1970s and early 80s, Monsignor Michael Buckley was an important figure as the person who headed up an ecumenical centre for renewal in Wetherby. And certainly, again, for those of us who are working in Yorkshire around that time, that was quite a profound influence, really. And another person, I moved on to be diocesan missionary in the Carlisle diocese in the mid-1980s, and was privileged to lead an ecumenical mission with Father Ian Pettit. And for me, that's another name of key influence, I think, across the board, not simply within the Roman Catholic community. And just lastly, I can't remember if this was a Fountain Trust or an ARM conference, my apologies, but one of those that I had the privilege of helping to lead worship at. But I remember the two main speakers were Father Brian O'Sullivan and Jim Graham from Gold Hill Baptist Church, and the combination of those guys and their input. And again, what that spoke of how the Spirit was moving was quite powerful. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Another plug for the North. Very good. Right. We have about 13 minutes left, and we do need to keep to time. So with some nervousness, I'm going to bring up the cross current of Wimber, Kansas City, Prophet, and Toronto. Any brief comments on I suppose your awareness of all these different influences and their impact perhaps on ARM during these decades? I'm going to go to Alan. Please do introduce yourself, remember, Alan.
I will. Alan Price. I was children's officer with ARM for just a brief period, and I was a church army officer at the time, and I think I think Wimber was a great influence. I've been as I said, a card-carrying charismatic since 1967, and all through my church army vocation sought to be who I was, which as far as I'm concerned, the Holy Spirit was part of the package deal. But I think when David Saville, who was the vicar at the time in Christchurch, Chorleywood, where I was a youth worker, he invited me to go over to the Signs and Wonders conference in Anaheim. Yeah. And I think, without a doubt, I was quite struck so much for all sorts of different reasons. But really what encouraged me so much was John Wimber's Christology. He was not just Holy Spirit oriented. You know, there really was a Christology, and it was really focused about Jesus. And there was a releasing, which I found personally very, very helpful. Even if I still didn't experience some of the things that other people seem to experience at conferences like that. But that's just my story. But I think because my particular focus by this time was about children and the Holy Spirit, it was one of the Kansas City prophets, Paul Kane, who had a particular influence. There was one particular talk he gave, which I had to say was very influential and very hopeful, because it was this thing that the Holy Spirit, as the saying goes, there's no junior version of the Holy Spirit. If you have the Holy Spirit, you have the full person of the Godhead. And for me, one of the great things, the levelers that we saw both in the influence of New Wine and with Anglican Renewal Ministries, and the particular things we were doing really, was that children just wanted to follow Jesus, and they just entered into the experience of the Holy Spirit as much as anyone else. But I was thinking, it is your question, John. I want to home in on it. I think there were great influences there, and some of them, I discern there was always a sense of fashion, and there still is a sense of fashion in the Christian world. There's always someone who comes up and has something to present us and gives us a new experience, a new way of looking at things, and then so we carry on. We do some of that, and we try and adopt that into who the people we are and how we do things. But then it is this thing. It's a movement. Charismatic renewal is not it never has been, as far as I'm concerned, static. There's the Spirit of God just moves, and it's up to us just to try and keep up with him.
There we go. That's some theology for you. Thank you very much, Alan. Anyone else want to speak to those different cross currents? And there was a fourth cross current as well that someone suggested that we had. I can't remember what it was though. Right at the beginning. Was it Chris? Was it you?
I think it was me talking about the Dales Bible Weeks and all that kind of thing, and the
the
movement that was pretty significant, certainly in the 70s and 80s around where I was in Yorkshire at that time.
Yeah. Anyone else like to speak to any of those? Okay, in which case, I'm going to jump to Global South connections, because I think this is something that is particularly important. We've already mentioned Soma, and we've had Valerie's wonderful example of, I suppose, a kind of transnational connection there of exchange between global North, global South leaders. I mean, there are a number of ways we could talk about this. One thing I'm interested in is, are there ways in which ARM learned or kind of, I suppose, learned things from Global South Anglicans during the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s? What are, and what were those things? You know, I know there were Soma teams going to various countries, various dioceses. There were bishops coming to ICOE, Lambeth Conference, pre-Lambeth Conference gatherings. Would anyone like to speak about those kinds of interactions, and in particular things that Global North Anglicans were learning? Don, I'm just warning you. I may come to you in a moment and ask, put you on the spot. But would anyone else like to speak to that? Rod.
Yeah, I can just say I have a perspective from having spent some time in the early 80s when I was doing my theological training, most of it in Cambridge, but some of it was out in South Africa at St Paul's Grahamstown, and that led to other links with South Africa over the ensuing years. And there were two things I think that struck me there. One, in the 80s, was how moving out of the English context, where there was still a lot of talk of Christian experience and worship in churchmanship terms in different strands of the Anglican Church. There was, in South Africa, I found that a lot of that had disappeared under renewal. Bill Burnett was Archbishop of Cape Town, I think, or had been. And there was a lot more natural mixing and laughter and respect across all the traditions of Anglicanism in South Africa, which I thought was lovely to be part of and a great experience to follow on from. And I think another angle was that in those days, this was while apartheid was still very prevalent and before the traumatic years of the 80s, that there was quite a strong association between the whole renewal agenda and social conscience, and the church standing out for a society beyond apartheid and what it would look like. And in the years since Mandela came to power and apartheid has taken more of a backseat, I think a lot of people out there, and I've had many conversations with them, have felt that a lot of the renewal agenda has been diminished and thinned, and it's because they lost something of that social conscience integrated with the earlier stages of renewal, to the point where the church has been groping around, really trying to find more of a purpose and a focus. So it's really those two things from my South African experience, which is about integration across the Anglican spectrum and breadth of vision across the whole nature of the kingdom.
Thank you very much, Rod. I may go to Don in a moment, if Don, you're happy to speak, but would anyone else like to speak to this question of global connections?
There's a very personal one. Don Batley joined one of our group, and lovely guy, got me to go around New Zealand. But he was very influential in helping me with the production of Saints for Healing. I don't think I could have written the book without him, and I always regret that I didn't really acknowledge his help when it was written. But he had a huge influence, I think, and certainly out in the in that part of the world, not just only in New Zealand, but in Southeast Asia.
And he, I believe he has, Don Batley, I think, has authored a kind of charismatic memoir, which I think is available if anyone's interested in that. Thank you, Roger. Don, may we come to you?
Just a quickie. One of the things I learned taking teams for SOMA overseas over the years was to try to take people from one parish. And as a former mathematician, I used to say that the benefits were the cube of the number of people actually were involved. And what people used to say was that they gained more from their parish than they actually gave overseas. And I think all I'm saying really is that there was a sort of mutual blessing that took place from people from one parish going overseas to see what the life was like in a different part of the world.
We'll just go to Bishop Graham, and then I think I'll head back to Christopher.
Thank you very much, John. Just very briefly, Bishop Denis Sengelani from Lubombo, Mozambique, spoke at one of the pre-Lambeth conferences, I think 1998, and he never actually kind of wore a charismatic label, but he was undoubtedly a very spirit-filled man who spoke so warmly about the gospel. And I remember the addresses at that conference. I had links with Mozambique as well myself when I was Bishop of Wilston, and went there on more than one occasion. But I just think it's worth remembering that he and his whole person, because he played a major part in the ending of the civil war in Mozambique, flying from the rebels to the government, and pushing the text about swords turned into plowshares and so on, and gathering weapons together to be dealt with. He was a significant figure in the restoration of unity in Mozambique. But he spoke at the 1998 conference very warmly.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a really important point there, and I want to follow up on that myself. I'm going to thank everyone and hand back to Christopher.
Well, John, just briefly to thank you really for guiding us through and for another incredibly stimulating conversation. As I think most of you should be aware, we have another one like this in a month's time, focused on the ministry of John Wimber, who of course has already been mentioned in our conversation. And we're looking to continue into the new year, perhaps with one focused on Toronto. But if there are other particular areas that you think would benefit from this kind of conversation, we'd love to hear your suggestions. And indeed, if there are contributions that you'd like to make or memories that you'd like to share, John, Finney and Felicity Lawson, Alan and I have been working on a questionnaire which is now available for anyone who would like to commit to paper any further thoughts or recollections. And of course, please don't be a stranger to the ongoing Ministry of Resource today, continuing the baton of Anglican Renewal Ministries. If there are ways that you'd like to be involved, the door is always metaphorically open. So thank you very much indeed for being with us, and look forward to seeing many of you, I hope, in a month's time.